Max Gorlin, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, you got MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well. Welcome back to another episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Today, we hit the teens. Can you believe it? Over 30 episodes over the past 30 odd days. And we're now only about 3 weeks left to go. Just shy of that, in fact, of the 50 Most Relevant for 2023. As we hit number 19 today, we're talking about one of the breakout premiums that nobody predicted in 2022. Jack Sinclair is who we're discussing today on the podcast. And joining me on this episode is you've got to know him very well throughout this preseason. I hope you've been loving his work. I know we have here at the Coaches Panel. It's MiniMonk. Hello, mate. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. How about yourself?
I'm good. Look, he's a fascinating guy to get into. We'll run through his data and trends and what he did for us in 2022. But so much of the preseason, MiniMonk, is spent throughout the months of January and February, especially kind of pontificating and hypothesizing around what might happen for us in the fantasy community. And while I'm sure there was probably someone somewhere that called it, there wasn't too many people that saw this big breakout come from him, were there?
No, and he really was in the same price bracket as Hewitt and Sicily to start the season across formats. And yet people have talked about them and the breakouts they had or progression back to being a top 6 premium in the case of Sicily. But the breakouts that they had, Sinclair had something similar. I mean, he went from being someone who was in the 80s across formats really to being, the number 1 defender in SuperCoach and top 3 in AFL Fantasy last year. Those are just phenomenal figures for him. He's just absolutely out of the box season, all Australian honours as well. Just a fantastic player to watch last year as well.
Yeah, he's not just a great fantasy player who's amazing to watch. A top score last year across the formats was also his career high scores. That was a 146 against the Western Bulldogs in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and a 150 against Carlton in SuperCoach. He is just defensive eligible for us this year, but MiniMonk's already alluded to that stunning season in terms of what he did in averages. A 102.9 in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and a 113.7 in SuperCoach. You are not getting him at the value that you got last year. If you want Sinclair, at least in your starting squad, you're going to be paying up for it. $934,200 in DT, just a touch over $910,000 in AFL Fantasy, and $626,200 in SuperCoach. It was already beautifully covered from MiniMonk just before about that all-Australian season. He also picked up his maiden best and fairest at the club, but he was amazing in so many different areas. He ranked elite for inside 50s, ground ball gets, intercept possessions, pressure acts, score involvements, effective kicks, contested, uncontested possessions. First in the entirety of the AFL League for kicks per game, in the top 10 for effective disposals, top 20 for bounces, meters gained, disposals. How do you sum up that 22 season in one word? Elite. He was just elite as a rebounding defender for us last year. And that stunning season did translate into fantasy scores. 10 Dream Team and fantasy tons last year. A few of them really, really big ones as well. A 133, a 140, and a 146 were his 3 scores of 120 plus. So some nice ceiling there for a defender. 7 additional scores on top of these 10 tons between 93 and 99. And in the only game he got tagged last year was the one game he dipped his score under 80. That average of 102.9 had him second amongst all defenders behind only Sam Doherty for averages and for total points in defenders. And inside the entirety of Dream Team and Fantasy, he ranked 10th last year for total points and had the 16th highest average. While in SuperCoach, even better, a seasonal average of 113.7 had him as the top defender across this format for points and averages. 19 tons. I didn't stutter. 86% of his games last year. 19 of those 22. He hits triple digits. 5 scores, 120 plus, and some really big ceilings here. 133, 135, 140, and 150 were just a few of those 120 plus scores. And just the one score under 80 all year, a 79, 7th for total points across the entirety of the game, and 8th for the highest average. Pretty safe to say, MiniMonk, if you didn't have him last year, you probably didn't have a great season towards the top of the ranks.
Oh, it hurt if you didn't have him last year.
Oh, yeah.
It really hurt because there were so many people that started, a couple of premium defenders, a couple of mid-prices down back, and they only really had a couple of upgrade options. And come in the early, 6 or 7 rounds, Sinclair's scoring pretty well, averaging about 105, 110 in SuperCoach and around about the 9,500 mark in AF. And people probably missed him at the upgrade point at that point. A lot of people got on him just before his bye and rode him from there. But if you didn't have him, man, it hurt because he just never dropped a bad score. His only bad game for the year was a game where he was tagged by Ryan Clark,
who kills every rebounder. Yeah.
He did a number of jobs on top end defensive premiums throughout the back half of the 22 season. And so you really can't blame him for that. If you've got a player, a defender premium, who's able to hit 100 mark in SuperCoach in nearly 90% of his games and doesn't drop below 80 in AF, except for when he's tagged, you take that and you run to the bank every day of the week. And there's only one reason. There's only one reason he's probably not in the top 10 of the 50 most relevant this year.
Yeah.
And it's the bleedingly obvious. It's the change in coach. And
well, let's talk about it, because that's the one that's got everyone concerned, because you look at it and you go, amazing. Maybe doesn't have the ceiling of tons that you'd want in SuperCoach, in Dream Teams, should I say? But that's mitigated by just how high that basement is of floor. But let's not get too critical on him. Let's talk about that. Ross Lyon comes in, known for being a more defensively minded coach, still had some fantasy weapons in his day, both at Fremantle and at St Kilda in his first iteration there. We've talked about this a few times on the podcast, that we let people know that you're a Fremantle supporter. Can you, before we look specifically about what it means for him at St Kilda and back to Sinclair, with the rebounders that were at his disposal at Fremantle, what were the things that you noticed? And is there any comparable lessons that we can correlate across with now that he's at St Kilda?
I think at Freo, he was known for a very controlling game style. There was a lot of switches, a lot of pressing the ball up the ground by just taking a short chip on the 45 and using that to control the game and slow it down a bit at times. And that often led to the low scoring game plan that you saw with Freo, through the mid to late teens. And I wasn't around playing too much fantasy during those times, but I can only imagine that, there was a few players in that Freo half back line like Johnson and McFarland, and to a lesser extent, players like Bradley Hill and Stephen Hill during their time that were able to score probably quite well through that. And I'd expect that he probably implements a similar game plan with the Saints. I mean, you've got the cattle to be able to do that. You've got a really strong midfield that can, shut it down, keep it in tight with Brad Steele, Zach Jones. They've got a few young, big-bodied midfielders that are going to try and come through and provide the same sort of presence. And maybe that's what he ends up doing. Maybe he employs a very similar game plan, and there's a lot of, chipping around the half-back flank, players getting a lot of +6s, being able to take a lot of effective kicks. And, maybe Sinclair can build a score build like that. But the problem is, Ross himself has said he's going to probably change his game plan to what he had when he was at Fremantle.
That's true.
And so
the game's changed.
The game has changed. It's been, 5-6 years since he last coached?
Been half a dozen seasons,
Yeah, so you really don't know what he's going to come into. And so I'd say that he's definitely a preseason watch, and the Saints are definitely a preseason watch to see how their game plan adjusts for the 2023 season under his coaching.
Yeah, we know probably one certainty about what was their back 7 or 8 matchups last year, where Hill was often on one of the flanks, Sinclair on the other. Ross Lyon's been really, really clear in numerous media outlets that Hill's moving back up to the wing. They want his drive and run that they loved. Now, remember, he was brought over to Fremantle under Ross Lyon's tutoring at that time. So he loves what he brings in terms of his run and carry, his skill, his dare. So we can kind of see a little bit of an opportunity opening up for Sinclair. Not so much in kick-ins. He's already got the bulk share in that. It's him, and then it really falls away to Webster. He's like well and truly ahead. It's not quite Luke Ryan territories, but it's heading in the ballpark where he's got the share. I suppose there's two ways of viewing him becoming the main solo rebounder, MiniMonk. One is he's got the ball always coming through him. He's the rebounder. He's the one they want to get the ball in his hands. He's the one they want to set up the play from kick-ins. He's the one they want to move it through. So that's the positive where we might see some scoring pop. The flip side of that is if he's the only generator of rebound and run, even if teams aren't going to aggressively tag like a Ryan Clark, he could find himself with some additional attention and as such, potentially a limited output, more so on his ceiling of fantasy scoring.
I think that's a fair comment. He's definitely going to be the quarterback of that Saints back six. He's going to be controlling everything. He has free reign to basically do whatever he wants with the ball in that back six. And he showed that last year as well.
He did.
And like you say, that can be a bad thing because it might mean that he gets a lot of attention. But not a lot of teams will be tagging off the halfback flank. Most teams tend to tag in the midfield because that's where they tend to think the damage is going to be done. And if it's a team that's tagging in the midfield, the attention's going to go to Jack Steele before it goes to Jack Steele.
100%.
Too many Jacks at St Kilda. It gets confusing as it is. And you look at his opening run and you can really only think that there's maybe one team that might tag him. And that's Essendon. They might send Caldwell back to tag him. But even then, it's a 50-50 whether he goes to Sinclair or to Steele. And the dreaded Ryan Clark tag doesn't come until after his bye. So if you're wanting to start him as a unique over players like Doherty, Brayshaw, Stewart, Sicily, he's got a pretty nice run to start the year. I mean, he's got a lot of games under the roof at Marvel where he absolutely racks it up. And St Kilda have got a relatively soft run to start the year. So he could be a really nice, unique option if you're wanting to go that way and go against the pack.
Yeah, he's under 15% ownership across all the formats, under 10% in some of them. I know there are some concerns in different corridors of the fantasy community that Jack won't have this plum halfback role. There's been sometimes people have gone and commented when they've gone to watch St Kilda doing match simulations or some training. Oh, he's been with the midfield group, and people always read a lot into that, sometimes for good reason, other times not. But the reality is, even if he doesn't play as the rebounder, there was still a number of games last year where he had some really strong centre bounce attendances between 31% and 71% of centre bounces. There was 4 weeks last year he sat in that portion of data. And in those 4 games, he averaged 99 in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and 103 in SuperCoach. If you contrast just that 4 games split across the year, that would still, by average, put him as a top 6 defender. So, yes, there's a lot that's changed, so it can't be apples and apples. But if that's he goes into the midfield, okay, he becomes a baseline ton defender for us. Fine, that's perfectly fine. And if you're looking to be aggressive and take the game on, as MiniMonk's alluded, is a very viable strategy due to his ownership and his scoring potential. If you're okay with that being the worst possible outcome, well, then happy days, you're away. What you're really, I suppose, looking for, MiniMonk, I'm keen on your take on this, is if you're starting Sinclair, you're probably hoping for at least the first 6 weeks, if not for the season. He matches it with the likes of a Sam Doherty in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam and pushes that 110, while at the very least maintains and holds that 115 range in SuperCoach. So between round 9 and 18 last year, which does include that Sydney tagged game, by the way, that 9-week stretch, he goes 114 in SuperCoach, 114 in DreamTeam and Fantasy. That's what you really need him to be right out of the gate to feel like him as a starting squad option is going to be a viable move.
Yeah, so in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, I think he has to either narrow the gap to Doherty or create separation away from the ones that are chasing him in Dawson and Brayshaw and Shaw, or not Shaw, sorry, and Stewart. In that gap, he needs to be able to build 5 points of separation there or gain 5 points on Doherty to be able to have the upside that you probably want to start with him. Whereas in SuperCoach, he needs to at least stay in the same range of pack as those other 600k defenders. And he can do it. I mean, we've talked about his run to start the season.
right.
There is absolutely a world where he ends up as D1 in SuperCoach after the first 6 weeks, and he's averaging 120, and he's got 5 points of separation from the rest of the pack.
Absolutely.
And there's a world where he's averaging 110 in AFL Fantasy over the first 6 weeks as well, and matching it with Sam Doherty. And so the question is, do you want to start him and try and take that punt and think that you've got yourself the D1 across formats, essentially, because he can match that level? Or do you want to upgrade into him at some point during the season? Upgrading into him at some point during the season is going to be hard.
If he flies out of the gate,
consistency. And you talked about his consistency through the year. He only had 1 game below 80. It was a tag. Tag came against Ryan Clark. The Sydney game against St Kilda comes right after his bye this year. It's going to be a really awkward time to be able to try and upgrade into him. So you're banking on him having a poor game or a couple of subpar games at some point early in the season for you to be able to jump onto him. There's easily an argument. You just start him because he's never going to get to a point where he's cheap enough to justify jumping on.
We talked about this the other day with Marcus Bontempelli, where his bad games are never so bad that you feel like you're getting him at a value point. You're always paying up to go and get him. And so really with Sinclair, what we're talking about is he's relevant, because if he starts the way he delivered in 2022, good luck getting him at a discounted price. And if you get a guy at the top of the tree in the back line that is unique and scoring with ceiling and a high floor, you're going to be setting yourself up for success. If he has a slower start to the year, maybe a tag comes, or some of that just St Kilda game style doesn't mesh early on with how they want to play, I can guarantee you, everybody, if he does drop cheap, will be screaming to get him as early as they can, because they know just how good of a fantasy prospect he can be. Whether he's in your starting squad or you're really watching him because you want to upgrade to him early in the season, he's relevant. And that's what this series is all about, is talking about the most relevant players. And without doubt, MiniMonk, he could define your season. Whether you're on him or off him to start, he could define your season.
He is the type of player that can take the season away in 6 games. And these are the really, really scary ones when it comes to your starting squad, because there's only about half a dozen of them across all formats and across all lines that can do it. Because if he has a stretch where he pops a couple of 140s, 150s,
and he did
in AFL Fantasy DreamTeam and SuperCoach, which is well within his wheelhouse, and he has 5% ownership, you have him, you're screaming up the ranks. You don't have him, you are selling the farm to try and get to him.
Yeah, 100%. And remember, the price only matters if you're purchasing or you're selling. If you're owning, the price doesn't matter. So if he's lost a little bit of value and it's like, oh no, people are getting him 50,000 cheaper, that's all right. You've got his points. The price only matters if you're selling or if you're purchasing. Other than that, the price doesn't matter. He's a fascinating guy to think about in salary caps, but equally MiniMonk in drafts, because people see how good he was last year. They do get concerned that, is this the outlier or is this just the start of a new normal? Where do you think he goes on draft days? He's no doubt a D1, but where do you see his range across the formats?
Oh, he's definitely no doubt a D1. And, you know, he comes into SuperCoach as quite literally the D1. He's the highest averaging SuperCoach player down back. But I don't think he'll go as the highest defender in SuperCoach. I think he probably goes around that, somewhere in the D3 to D5 range, depending on how people are viewing the others around him. And that probably puts him at around about the middle of the second round in that format. Yeah. And I think in AFL Fantasy probably drops a little bit further, probably about the D5, D6 range on some people's radars, maybe a D4. I'm talking overall rankings. But I think in AFL Fantasy, people are going to be more inclined to take the big mids, the big forwards, a couple of big rocks that we have, and he might push to a late second rounder, maybe early third rounder. I think if you can get him on the turn of the end of the second round, early third round, you'd be pretty happy locking him away as your D1 there.
Yeah. Oh, I think you're spot on, man, with that. Hey, MiniMonk, as always, you've been absolutely nailing it over the past week. You've been giving us great analysis on Zach Butters, Nat Fyfe, and now again today, Jack Sinclair. So thank you for your work, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
If you want to go and check out the article on Jack or any of the other players revealed so far in the 50 most relevant, they are online for you now at coachespanel.tv. If you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you've given a nice 5-star rating and review. We've got new podcasts dropping every single day right throughout pretty much most of February, let alone for what we've been doing so far for you through all of January. And our Patreon supporter group is a place where you can go for just a few dollars a month. You can support us here at the Coaches Panel. It helps us practically do what we do. And just as a reward for it, we'll kick some extra content your way, hidden groups, and a bunch of other podcasts, Keeper League content, and a heap of other stuff. You can find that at coachespanel.tv. Number 18 in the 50 most relevant tomorrow. Who is it? Let me give you a little bit of a clue. Not very often when you talk about a premium at the top of their line that you then ascribe and assign value to them. But the splits between this premium in their line, between what they gave us for good chunks of last year, could put him as the number one in his line. Where there's another chunk, it could put him as irrelevant. But there's a big question mark that I think a lot of people are assuming will go positive for him. But is this person going to be the top of his line or right near it like many suspect? Or are the doubts valid? Who are we talking about? I'll tell you tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.